Hello, and welcome to Top Shelf Books. If you're joining us for the first time, then we are going to hopefully add some books to your TBR pile, familiar favorites, something new. If you're continuing from the last episode, we are still going to be talking about the Western, and I am so impressed with you for sticking with us. Welcome to episode 10, part 2. So, you still don't want to read a Western? Let me tell you why I think that you should. So, one of the things that happens with my students when it's essay writing time is that I get someone, sometimes several someones, that comes to me and says, how do I improve my vocabulary? And there's really only one answer to this, which is you need to read things. And I often tell them, read outside of your comfort zone. I am all for all types of reading. If you like vampire romances, you do you. If you want to read Reddit forums and just drown in them, that is fine. But I often find myself recommending genre fiction to my students because it's something that they don't have a lot of experience with. So, yes, classic literature definitely has benefits, but maybe spread your wings, add something new. And if you are an avid reader, you may have come across the various read harder challenges. So, challenge yourself to read something different. Westerns for you might be something different. So, one of my main themes of this particular episode is looking at just how expansive this genre can be, how much can be packed into it, even though maybe the image we get in our minds when we think of a Western has very sort of stock things attached to it. And I started our discussion by saying that my favorite, and so many people's favorite, I'm not original here, is Lonesome Dove. And I was thinking of Lonesome Dove when I decided to recommend Leaving Blythe River by Catherine Ryan Hyde, because I was thinking of the relationship between Call and the young man that the ranch had adopted and raised after his mom's death. So, one of the things that we come across in Westerns is the domestic relationship, sometimes disrupted, sometimes violent. We'll be talking later about The Son by Meyer, and the domestic things there are so disrupted that I had to stop listening to the audiobook because it was just making my heart hurt. But recommending to you Leaving Blythe River for the relationship between a father and son, while Rocky still in, still hoping to preserve it. And I wanted to pair it because I've been creating pairs for you as gunslingers of the Old West carried two guns. Why not carry two books? You might finish one, right? And then you'll need the second. Or in the case of the Western, if you are maybe not excited to delve into this genre, maybe pairing a Western with another book is a good way to start. So Hisham Matar's The Return, again, the search for the father, what the father means, a very beautiful book. Can you find love in the Old West? People seek it, people try to escape it. In Sarah Gailey's Upright Women Wanted, there are some women that are trying to escape as much as anything else. And again, this is one of those books that shows you how far the genre of the Western can be pushed. Now, historically, one of the ways to find a partner in the territories as the country expanded was to buy a bride, was to write home and request someone to come out and share in your life. And Zug, of course, traces this not just in the 19th century, but if you're interested in how that worked. And she has a new book out called You'll Do about marrying for reasons other than love. And I suspect on the frontier there were definitely times when people created marriages of protection or convenience. One of the unfortunate realities of the frontier is, of course, violence against Native Americans. And I wanted to introduce that to you in a couple of different titles. Of course, I could have found any number of historical titles to do this, but Lonesome Animals by Bruce Hulbert, there's a crime happening and mutilation of Native American bodies that are trying to be solved. And that pairs nicely with the historical true crime mystery Covered with Night. Or if you're looking for something YA, Tingle's House of Purple Cedar. In this, it's not a murder mystery, but you do have a Native American character that gets attacked and kind of reprimanded in front of others, and the characters have to decide how to pursue justice and how we get justice. And this is, of course, a question that's still happening in the Native American community. How do we do justice to this group of people who has been dispossessed, who have been mistreated? How do we reconcile and deal with that today? I recently was talking to my sister about the flaws with learning history, and we agreed that as we had gone through high school and college and even into our graduate work, that one of the things that troubled us about learning history is that it tends to be conveyed in discrete packages. So, this is what was happening in America, this is what was happening in Britain, this is what was happening in Africa, but it's not connected, and it's difficult for your mind to get a handle on the fact that things were happening at the same time. Well, one of the things that was happening while the frontier was expanding and people were going into the West to settle and do all of the troublesome things that happened in the West in terms of dispossessing people, was the bone wars. So the collection of fossils and the scientific fights over naming them and what they meant. So Michael Crichton's Dragon Teeth looks at the collection of fossils in the Old West. And then there's also the Bone Hunter's Revenge, which is the fight between the different scientific schools of thought. There are other books that fit nicely with the Bone Hunter's Revenge. It's been written about by several other people, and it's even been turned into a graphic novel. And if you have scientists in your life, it's really hilarious to imagine these people that are usually very rational and reasonable fighting it out in the press and unfortunately damaging everyone's scientific reputation and the reputation of science in general for quite some time. In the first episode on the Western, I talked about the romance of the frontier and the idea that people sought the frontier as a chance to start over. And this is still part of the American imagination, the idea that we can move to another place and things will be different. We will be different. And of course, in the 19th century, this would have been a very attractive idea for African Americans who either were enslaved, depending on when you set the story, or were coming out of slavery, and regardless of whether they were in the North or the South, were dealing with prejudice. And we have still not solved these issues in our country. We have still not overcome them. So, one place you can look at those issues and some of the origin points for them in the Western is Paradise Sky by Joe R. Lansdale, in which he fictionalizes the life of Nat Love. I could not find a history of Nat Love that I was particularly happy with, so I'm going to suggest to you the one by the Charles River editors as sort of a starting place, but if anyone knows something that would serve better, I am open to instruction. And speaking of the frontier, one of the myths, of course, perpetuated by Frederick Jackson Turner in his thesis about the frontier is this idea of an empty landscape or landscape that wasn't being used. And of course, we know from current and past Indigenous writers that this is absolutely fictional. There were people there and they were making use of the land. They were just not doing it in the way that the people that wished to dispossess them would have it be done. So if you are wanting to read about these quote unquote empty landscapes, some westerns that are fictional that may suit you, The Dying Grass by William T. Volman. Now, this is part of a longer series that looks at key events in American history, and he really brings to life historical characters, but you can sort of dive in and out of the series if you like. Michael Punke's Ridgeline, and we're going to see him again when we talk about the Mountain Men. Ridgeline was particularly enjoyable to me because it's a very immediate book. It reminded me of the writers of the writing of, Ralph Peters. When he writes about the Civil War, it made it really feel current and like something was happening. And if you want a glimpse into these same events through history, Thunder in the Mountains by Daniel J. Sharfstein and The Earth is All That Lasts by Mark Lee Gardner look at the historical issues that were happening in the West with the Native Americans. Again, there are many, many books that cover the same ground, the most famous of which is probably Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And there's also the more recent political science text Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, which I highly recommend if you are just trying to get a handle on where do I start with Indigenous history? Where do I start to learn about these beliefs? It is a great introduction and a wonderful text. When we define the Western, one of the ways that we define it is by the characters that are doing the action in the story. So, cowboys, horse thieves, outlaws, also mountain men. And you can find those in The Revenant. Um, you can find them in a more historical fashion in Give Your Heart to the Hawks by Win Blevins. And I talked to my reading friends for this one, and they said this is the place to go if you're wanting to read about the mountain men. And then the more classic, more famous A.B. Guthrie Jr.'s The Big Sky. All of these have those sort of central mountain men characters that are pushing into the West and conquering landscapes, conquering creatures, unfortunately, sometimes seeking to conquer people as well. I also mentioned in our first episode that one of the things that I love about the Western is that it can be expanded in all sorts of directions. And we have a current group of writers, a current cadre, I guess, of young writers who are really pushing the Western into new places. And that's really exciting. So if you need your Western with a warlock, then you want to check out The Ragged Company. I mean, who doesn't need a warlock in their Western? Or maybe you want the power of Satan himself, in which case you want Silver on the Road, which is the start of a series. A shorter Gothic Western is The Hangman Feeds the Jackal, in which the main character is dealing with visions that may or may not be true that are haunting him of an enemy and pursuing him. And this really reminded me of The Gunslinger, so it could fit nicely with that. And there's also Cold as Hell, which is Western horror fantasy all mixed together. So the West encompasses not just the 19th century history that we are used to, but that space can be used and expanded into fantasy, into horror, into science fiction very, very well. The Flicker of Old Dreams by Susan Henderson is maybe one of the outliers on our in our discussion today. It's not a Western in the sense that when it takes place, it's moved into the future a little bit. But I want to mention it to you because it has a cross-generational friendship, and I think that those don't get enough attention in literature. There's still such an emphasis. Again, this is one of my bookish complaints. So publishers, if you're listening, there is this sort of sense in literature that characters hit 25 and everything should be figured out and their life is over. And that is very frustrating to those of us who are no longer 25 because it seems that life keeps going. So I recommend to you The Flicker of Old Dreams. And if you're wanting to pair it with something, Ray Bradbury's Old Fashioned Lime Vanilla Ice is a short story, but it also includes a wonderful cross generational friendship. It is refreshing as a lime vanilla ice would be. Of course, we cannot talk about pushing into the West without mentioning the gold rush. And I wanted to include some things about Western mining and sort of the mineral rush in general, and I was not successful in finding text for this. So if you have any suggestions, I found a few thrillers that take place in mines that had been closed in the West, but I wasn't finding anything that made me very happy. So I would be happy to hear from you if you have any suggestions. If you are looking for the gold rush in fiction, Daughter of Fortune by Isabel Allen. Of course, Allen is very famous for doing magical realism. And here we have a female character going into these territories and facing all the dangers that belong to them. And we've seen in some of our other selections women taking on other identities to do this as well. And then there is, of course, a more classic one, Irving Stone's Men to Match My Mountains. This one is of its time. It does have some problematic sentences in there, so I will leave you to decide if you want to stick with it or not, but it does cover that era and the gold rush. Asian American immigration also was happening at the time of the gold rush and has been the topic of several very popular novels that expand the Western. How much of these hills is gold? Four Treasures of the Sky and The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su, which is almost basically an Asian Western, focusing on a Chinese character. I would love to see one that expands this into Japanese culture as well. And probably that's because I always want to read Shogun and Lonesome Dove together. So, again, publishers, if you're listening, my wish list is for a Japanese Western epic, if anyone wants to create that. If you want to look into the history of what was happening with these immigrants in this era, and the things that they faced, which were truly awful, when it comes to things like indentured servitude and basically the terrible labor conditions, then you want Gordon H. Chang's Ghosts of Gold Mountain, also a fairly recent publication, but giving us a more inclusive picture of what was happening in the West and who was actually there and what they were doing. I don't know if any of you grew up reading the Little House books, but for whatever reason, most of the women that I grew up with did, and we of course played the game. We never watched the show, the group that I knew, but when it comes to thinking about the West and expanding into the West, one of the things that I always think of is homesteading, and we can look at that historically in the book Homesteading the Plains Toward a New History by Richard Edwards, but Laura Ingalls Wilder gives us a good view of it in books like By the Shores of Silver Lake or By the Banks of Plum Creek. Even though she was a child when this was happening, she's able to look back and describe what her parents went through to try to claim territory in these areas and remain safe and endure weather and crop failures and things like that. Another book that looks at homesteading, and in this case, looking at it from an African American perspective, is The Personal History of Rachel Dupree by Anne Weisgardner. And this is about combining claims in the West and trying to get more land and trying to set up a life on that land. I didn't expect to be talking about the Mormons when it comes to the Western, but as I gathered material, it just sort of happened. So we can't talk about Westerns and completely leave out Zane Grey. So I would like to recommend to you, Riders of the Purple Sage, if you are wanting a more classic Western. Of course, there are tons of Zane Grey novels, so you don't have to stick with this one. But the reason it came into my mind was the recent popularity of Under the Banner of Heaven by Jon Krakauer. So you could pair those two together. And if you are feeling ambitious, you can draw in some classical literature by bringing in a study in Scarlet, which I went back to read a few years ago. I know I read it in college, but I didn't remember. And I was surprised to discover that the American West and the Mormons made an appearance in there as well. And there are Victorian attitudes, of course, about that religion. So, be aware that Doyle is writing out of his own beliefs and his own time as well. In the first episode about the Western, I did focus on animals in the West because I love to read natural history, but I didn't get to talk about the various types of creatures that become mounts in the West. So there's not just the traditional horse, but also, of course, bull riding. So if you are wanting a glimpse into that goes from the historical into the modern, there's Chasing Rodeo by W.K. Stratton. If you want just the more modern sports view, Fried Twinkies, Buckle Bunnies, and Bull Riders, Josh Peter. I am of course not. I am not sanctioning Buckle Bunnies as part of the title. I don't love it as a description, but it is what just what the author has chosen, so we'll stick with it. There were also camels in the West, right? The United States Camel Corps. If you have not taken the time to take a look at them, they are worth your time. They are worth a Google. So I've included the YA title Because of the Camels by Blair. If you want a fantasy version where hippos are the vehicle of choice, then you want River of Teeth by Sarah Gailey, and we've mentioned her writing before. She is all about expanding the Western. And then a natural history by Nance. Rodeo and Animal History really takes into consideration the impact on animals and just how many animals are used in the rodeo. I don't know if you have ever seen the little kids riding on the sheep, for example. They are adorable, but I don't know if it's good for the sheep, or the little guys. I don't know. I don't know enough about sort of the ethics of this. So Nance tries to guide us through that and to take into consideration the impact that the rodeo has on animals. Up until now, we have, of course, been talking about the Western as centered in the American West, but it wouldn't be me talking to you if I didn't try to blur the boundaries a little bit. So I don't know exactly what the connection is, but there is a similarity between Australian bushrangers and outlaws and the American cowboys and outlaws. It's not a perfect match, but I thought if maybe you wanted to be Western adjacent, I should suggest you some titles. And the reason I thought of this is the book Sister Kate by Jean Bedford. I read when I was too young to read this, I'll be honest. It has some disturbing content in it for a book that is geared towards, I believe, younger readers. But it made me think of Ned Kelly and the Bushrangers, so I wanted to suggest to you some books that cover that material. So if you're wanting it in fiction, there's Out of the Mist, which is about an Australian female outlaw. There is The Untold by Courtney Collins, Moonlight by Gary Linnell, which is not Ned Kelly, but another outlaw, but it does have some wonderful queer content. And then if you want to head back into the American West, The Outlander by Gil Adamson, a female outlaw on the run from her brothers-in-law. I hope at this stage I have maybe convinced you to pick up something that is outside of your usual mainstream reading. One of the reasons that I love to share books with you and I love to talk to other readers is I'm always looking for the next book to add to my list or the next topic to dig into. I really love doing the research and doing the legwork to try to find things. And I will say, when I thought about introducing you to some history and culture of the American West, I hesitated because there's just so much, and I don't want to leave out anything important, and I don't want to have sort of a bias that leaves out Indigenous voices. So please understand that the books that I'm about to recommend, this is really just a starting point, but they all have wonderful resources and they can point you to more books. And if there's something in particular that you want to know about that I'm not mentioning, please get in touch and I will try to find books that address that in particular. But some general histories of the American West: Brand's Dreams of El Dorado, West Continental Reckoning, and then The American West by Hine, which is actually a re-envisioning of some of the issues that well, not issues, some of the myths that we have gathered about the West. And then there's also journalist Christopher Ketchum's This Land, which is about the environmental destruction that is happening in the West and some of the things that we are losing because of politics and government and partisanship in the West. And it's really worth your time. All right, we've reached the end of our second episode together, and to end, I wanted to leave you with some books that may or may not be Westerns. They come up in some lists, and then other people argue against them. Little Big Man by Thomas Berger is often considered a satire against the Western, so it uses a lot of the tropes, but it subverts them. If you want classic literature, Willa Cather's My Antonia is set, of course, in the West and draws on a lot of the things that you would be getting in a Western, but it's not a traditional Western. And then finally, The Sisters Brothers, which again uses some of those Western tropes, and you get really poignant moments with the brother who is struggling throughout this book. But whether or not it counts as an actual Western or whether it's some new format, I will leave up to you if you venture into that. So if you're not ready for just traditional Western yet, maybe you want something that does something near the Western, but is not quite that. As always, I am so grateful to be part of your day and that you would, you know, let me take up some of your time. I hope that maybe I'm on in the background while you're doing something that you really enjoy. Maybe you're getting a chance to put your feet up, do some crochet, color, look through things on your phone that you've not had the time for. But here are some of today's titles, and I hope that one of them is going to be making its way into your life. More of today's titles with my traditional reminder to please support your public libraries. They can help you find more wonderful titles, and there's usually someone there either checking out the books or someone in the stacks that would love to talk to you about something that you can add to your TBR. More titles, and my traditional reminder that if you are lucky enough to have bookstores near you, please support your local bookstores. Please support indie booksellers. As always, if there are titles that you think should have been on the list or there's something I have managed to overlook in a glaring fashion, please let me know. I do make mistakes, so I'm always happy to add more books. And there are things I have just not come across in my travels that I would love to know about. I am also always happy to help you find books on a particular topic. So if you want something to turn into an episode, please let me know. But if you don't want sort of a whole episode on something, but you just are interested in a topic, you're not sure where to start, I love to do that kind of research, and you are always welcome to send it my way. And here are the last of today's titles. Again, I hope you found something in the list that you enjoy. Wishing you the very best day. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach me at navalianlibrary@gmail.com, and I would love to hear from you.